Hello, history scholars. Welcome back to AP World History. I should have recorded this on Rosh Hashanah, so happy Rosh Hashanah, everybody. Is that sacrilegious? I don't know. Anyway, welcome back to AP World History. This is Mr. Ancharsky, and this is Chapter 4 of our discussion about the networks of exchange. And specifically, we're going to take a look at the Mongol presence in China under the Yuan Dynasty. No, I mean, I don't know. It's just, I give you the basic information, and then there's always people that will randomly comment on. I don't want to get into all this. Anyway, so let's look at the kind of impact of the Mongols on China. Your bell work on the screen, you should be able to identify a change and a continuity in Russia and the Middle East between 1100 and 1450. Again, think about the Mongols. What are they keeping the same? What are they changing? So yes, we're going to look at our final presentation, final chapter about the Mongols. Yes, we're going to look at the Mongols in China because there are some important developments that happen in the Yuan Dynasty that are going to impact future Chinese dynasties. And we are going to see kind of China take a more prominent position in the Silk Road under the Yuan Dynasty. So you should be able to kind of focus on these. You should focus on these sorts of things when I'm talking today. You should be able to explain how empires influence trade. We literally did an LEQ about this, and how they influence communication between different cultures over time. So look out for some examples of, say, non-Mongols traveling across the Mongol Empire and documenting what they see. So as usual with the Mongols, let's start out with where they come from. In this case, where do they come from in terms of Chinese history? Well, we have to go back to our initial discussion of the Mongols back in chapter 2. Well, the Mongols are going to largely begin their direct invasion of Eastern Asian societies in the 1220s, pretty early on. And we see that most directly with the conquest of northern Chinese kingdoms of the Qin Dynasty, Jin, and the Western Xi-Sha Empire. But largely the kind of complete unification of China, so not just the north, but the south as well, will be directed by Genghis Khan's grandson, a guy by the name of Kublai Khan. Kublai Khan is arguably the second most important Khan in terms of kind of the wider world history aspect. And he is going to be the primary mover and shaker in invading the southern Song dynasty. So remember, kind of the Chinese were initially invaded by Genghis Khan, the northern Chinese kingdoms of the Qin dynasty, of the Xi-Sha Empire. But eventually, under Kublai in the 1270s, we are going to see the destruction of the Southern Song dynasty. So the Southern Song dynasty, remember, they fled south after the kind of whole debacle when it comes to the invasion by the Shurshins, by the Qin dynasty in the north. So we do see that the Southern Song dynasty will be invaded eventually by the 1270s. And after this happens, we are going to see some changes in Chinese history. Yeah, we're also going to see some continuity. So when the Mongols invade China, they are going to unify Chinese-speaking kingdoms both in the north and in the south. We see this unification of China linguistically. China, remember, has very many different dialects, but also unification politically as well. And this is a high school history class, so sometimes, detail, I'm not going to get into this. Anyway, so let's take a look at kind of some changes and some continuities under this direction of Kublai Khan. So Kublai Khan is going to, when he invades the Southern Song dynasty, he is going to say that I have claimed the mandate of heaven. So there's a continuity right off the bat. Under Kublai Khan, we see this continuation of the dynastic cycle, of the philosophical and political idea of the dynastic cycle. So Kublai is going to say, I have the mandate of heaven. I have the divine right to rule according to Chinese custom, Chinese tradition. And we do see that there is the founding of a new ruling family in Chinese history, and that is the Yuan Dynasty. So the Yuan Dynasty is going to be the Mongol ruling dynasty of China. So the idea of China remains. There's just a new group of people in charge. It's the Mongols, at first under the rule of Kublai Khan, who looks like a cool dude. But we are going to see some changes, and that's what I'm going to mostly focus on. So there is some continuity. There is still this dynastic system. There is this imperial system, the rule through the mandate of heaven. But we do see some changes, and one of them is going to be the creation of a new city, the city of Tatu, which eventually becomes the city of Beijing, so a new political center of the Yuan Dynasty. But we're also going to see that the Mongols are going to build up a massive palace complex called the Forbidden City. And the Forbidden City is something actually that future Chinese dynasties will rule out of. It's a huge city, almost mini city size, like small town size palace complex in the center, well, not the center, but in Beijing. And it is going to kind of be forbidden for outsiders who aren't Mongols to come into the city, to come into the palace, I should say. So the palace complex is massive, and it's going to be built up under Kublai Khan. That's something that's new in Chinese history, is this structure of the Forbidden City. Well, we're going to take an exploration, you could say, of the Mongol government structure. So let's take a look at that. Well, according to some historians, and it is debated exactly whether or not this system existed, but for our purposes, let's just say it did, we are going to see that there is a class/ethnic-based hierarchy under the Yuan Dynasty. And this ethnic hierarchy is going to kind of be the justification for how the Mongols will rule over China. They're going to say, we're the guys on top. We have the political power. We have the social power. You native Chinese people, you are on bottom. So this kind of class hierarchy is based mostly on ethnic lines. There is going to be kind of limited interaction, as we'll see in a second, between these ethnicities. On top, obviously, the Mongols. That's where all the emperors come from. They're all Mongols. We also see kind of that the Mongols, they will incorporate groups outside of China into their political structure. For example, we have Central Asian nomads. They're going to be involved in the military of the Mongols in China. They'll also take up government positions as well. We have Muslims transplanted from the Middle East. That's a big thing the Mongols did. They would move around cultures and as such see the diffusion of religion and culture. So we do see that Muslims from the Middle East, from Central Asia, they will be relocated to China to help administer government. So kind of they are taking Islamic mathematicians, making them into tax collectors, kind of bringing them over. How do we make government more efficient? We need smart people to rule over to govern our society. But at the bottom is going to be the Chinese themselves, the northern Chinese versus the southern Chinese. And kind of this is going to cause a lot of resentment, as you might imagine, among native Chinese people. Native Chinese people are going to look at the fact that they're on the bottom of this social hierarchy. And as we're going to see later on today, Mongols, not very popular. The Mongols in China are viewed as barbarians. They are viewed as outsiders. They are viewed as enforcing a very rigid class hierarchy that benefits outsiders rather than native Chinese people. So we are going to see that there will be kind of limited contacts between the Mongols and the native Chinese. This is a way to reinforce this ethnic hierarchy. And we see that best expressed in things like the banning of intermarriage between native Chinese people and Mongols. We see that native Chinese people are forbidden from learning Uyghur script, learning Mongolian script. So we do see kind of that a class hierarchy is enforced, and one that negatively alienates Chinese people from the ruling Mongol family. And as we're going to see, spoiler alert, native Chinese people will rebel against the Mongols, and that will be the Mongol decline in China, the Yuan Dynasty's decline in China. And yet, that's not to say that the native Chinese didn't have an impact on the Mongols themselves. And we're going to actually see that in how the ruling Mongol family, the Yuan Dynasty, they are going to assimilate or adopt aspects of Chinese culture into their own society. There are some things they reject. They, in general, are rejecting Neo-Confucianism. An expression of that culturally is the rejection of foot binding as a practice on Mongol women. So foot binding's rejected. Remember, Mongol society, relatively gender egalitarian. So foot binding's rejected. That's cool. And yet the Mongols do adopt elements of native Chinese culture. They adopt clothing, silk robes, silk clothing. They are going to adopt Chinese styles of art. And you can see an example of that in this picture right here. This is a Mongol era print in China. So a Chinese print during the Mongol rule in China. And art, in a way, serves as propaganda. That's a general kind of rule in world history. And this picture is actually no exception. And actually, if you can see in the image towards the upper, can I tell my whatever's, that is the upper right-hand corner. We are seeing kind of a series of caravans. And down here, we've got the Mongols who are protecting them. We've got dogs right there, little doggy, little thin doggy. Yeah. But what does this have to do with propaganda? Well, essentially, the Mongols are portraying themselves as the protectors of overland trade. And if they're the protectors of overland trade, aren't they benefiting China? Aren't they a good thing for China? So this is an example of propaganda in a way. And, if I'm talking about a piece of art and describing it in detail and what its purpose is, it might be on the test. So we do have kind of this example of art right here that is a form of propaganda that is combining the Mongol kind of need to justify their rule, but also Chinese styles of art. We see the Mongols will adopt Chinese medicine as well. And in general, we can kind of describe Mongol culture in China as a mix of Islamic influences from their conquests in the Middle East, bringing over these Muslim Muslim government officials. Jesus, Muslim is a figure in Islam, actually, Isa. So we are seeing kind of this spread of Islamic culture into China. We'll talk about that more later. We see kind of the elements of Hellenism, of Greek culture, that's also coming from the Middle East, thanks to the Islamic Golden Age. We see the influence of China, obviously. But the Mongols, they keep it real, right? They are going to kind of maintain their horseback nomadic culture. So let's look at elements of government, because we will see some continuity, but for the most part, we will see changes. And one of the biggest changes, actually, is that the Yuan dynasty is much more receptive to foreigners, much more open to outside influences. And this is a rejection of strict Neo-Confucian xenophobia. So we are going to see that the Mongols are very open to bringing in foreigners to help govern, but also to trade with. And we're going to focus first on this idea of how the Mongols are bringing in especially Muslim scholars to help administer government in their Yuan dynasty. So a Mongol kind of thing that they do across Eurasia is bringing scholars from across the empire so that they can help administer local government. The best and the brightest, they are going to be used in local administration in China. And that's no exception in other places of the Mongol Empire. So we will see Muslim scholars making their way into China. And we can kind of see that in this image right here. This is a mosque, a Muslim house of worship in China, in a Chinese style. So we do have kind of these importing, I guess you could say, of outsiders to administer government, to be things like tax collectors, census takers. But we also see that native Chinese people, they can still have a say in local government, especially in urban government. So native Chinese people mostly going to take care of day-to-day things in cities. But we also see that the Mongols will be very open to creating not just an export economy, but one that also imports things. So China is going to be open up to Silk Road trade, not only in terms of exports, which we've seen before, but what we haven't seen before is a lot of imports going into China. So we do see that there will be a lot of diffusion of culture and science and trade goods going into China under the Yuan Dynasty. And some examples of that, we will see the diffusion of Islamic science going to China. For example, new technologies like the astrolabe, new technologies and scientific concepts like Arabic numerals, which actually come from India, but yeah. So we are going to see kind of new Islamic science being introduced into China thanks to this opening up of China by the Mongols. But we also see how the native Chinese people, they'll be kind of introduced to new concepts of horseback riding from Central Asian nomads. And we'll talk about some other examples of Islamic science in China. The other one is the water wheel, but we'll get there. But another big thing about the Mongols in China is that they are going to be very open to welcoming foreigners, even those who come from outside of the Mongol Empire. And two examples of that are Marco Polo. I said that weird. Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta. Marco Polo, he's a Venetian, a guy from Venice, who is going to undergo this massive journey. I think it's like 24 years on this massive journey across Eurasia. I'll show a map in a second. But he's going to want to document what he sees in China and bring it back to Europe. And he's willing and able to do that because the Mongols are inviting. They're literally inviting Marco Polo to stay with them. In fact, Kublai Khan keeps him hostage for a little bit. But we do see that there is this openness to allowing foreign travelers to go to China. And these foreign travelers, like Marco Polo, they're seeing all these crazy, wacky Chinese things. They're seeing things like paper money. Whoa, they're using paper as currency? That's bonkers. They're bathing regularly? That's bonkers. There's 3,000 baths in Hangzhou. That's what Marco Polo's saying. And you'll read a primary source about that, actually. So Marco Polo, he's seeing what he sees in China. He's writing it down, bringing it back to Europe. There's an example of cross-cultural communication. The other example is Ibn Battuta. Ibn Battuta, who we'll talk about more later, is an Islamic scholar from Morocco. He is going to, much like Marco Polo, undergo a massive journey across Africa, parts of Europe, and Asia. He's going to document what he sees. He's going to write it down. He's going to bring it back to, say, North Africa, to Morocco. So Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo, they demonstrate the building of cross-cultural communication between the West, the Islamic world, and the European world, the Christian world, to the Far East. Ask me sometime why the game Marco Polo is named after him. So this is Marco Polo's journey. I'll show Ibn Battuta's journey later. But we see how he is going from Venice all the way to the Middle East. Guess what? How is he able to travel overland? You guessed it, the Silk Road. Yes, the promotion of trade by the Mongols of the Silk Road. If you do not get this question right, I don't know what to say. The Mongols promoted and increased trade. That's what they did. I'm sick of saying that at this point. I love the Mongols to death. They increased trade. So guess what? Marco Polo goes to China, then he doesn't. Then he comes back to Europe. Excellent. So Marco Polo, again, an example of cross-cultural communication between the West, between Europe, between Venice specifically, and China. But getting back to the Chinese, more accurately, getting back to government under the Mongols, let's look at some things that are changing in China. Well, the big thing that the Mongols will change is that they will reject Neo-Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism is viewed as not allowing for this key idea of trade. Remember, Neo-Confucianism is skeptical of trade, but with the Mongols, we will see a decline in the government adoption of Neo-Confucian principles. So the Mongols going to reject Neo-Confucianism for one thing. They are going to be religiously tolerant. There's not just going to be toleration of Buddhists and Confucians, but also, guess what? Jews, Christians, Muslims. So religious tolerance, something that is new, you could say, in China. We also see that there's a better status for women in general, at least for Mongol women. There's no foot binding. That's gauche. That's not, I love saying that word. That's not considered kind of proper etiquette by the Mongols, so they get rid of that. But one of the big things that the Mongols will get rid of when they invade China, when they set up a government structure, is that there's not going to be a civil service exam. Remember, the civil service exam, it is based on Confucian principles. And the Mongols are rejecting Confucianism. They are going to also similarly reject the civil service exam. So no more civil service under the Yuan Dynasty. Huge change in Chinese history. And instead of the civil service, guess what the government structure is going to look like? Well, it's going to be the emperor, the Mongol emperor, the Mongol Khan, picking out who they think is most suited for the job. And that could be in terms of merit, but it could also be in terms of loyalty. So as we'll see later on, the fact that there's no civil service exam and the fact that the emperor picks out the government workers partially based on loyalty, that's going to lead to corruption. And something that you might notice so far, when you compare China under the Mongols to, say, the Golden Horde or to the Ilkhanate, is that the Mongols have a more direct involvement in shaping internal Chinese politics, as opposed to, say, the kind of more light touch approach that the Mongols had in the Golden Horde or the Ilkhanate. And another thing that the Mongols are introducing is going to be a very decentralized idea of creating provinces. These provinces are going to be ruled over by Mongols, by Mongol princes, by Mongol nobles. So we will see kind of an element of decentralization in this province system. But before you go saying that the Mongols were against education if they were so opposed to the civil service exam, guess what? Well, we are going to see that the Mongols will promote education. Kublai Khan's going to set up like kind of public schools in a way in rural communities. And the purpose of creating schools under the Mongols and in general is to train efficient workers, efficient and smart government workers. These schools, they're going to be not just kind of some elements of Confucianism. They're still going to read Confucius. He's a classic. But we do see the incorporation of non-Confucian texts, of Islamic texts, hell, even of Greek and Roman texts. So we do see that there is a decline in the influence of Confucianism. We see the rise of outside influences. But we're also going to see that the Mongols, they need to be able to communicate with everyday Chinese people. So we will see under the Mongols the standardization of a major Chinese dialect of Mandarin. Mandarin is one of the most widely spoken Chinese dialects even to this day. and it's going to become kind of officialized and standardized under the Mongol rule in China. Let's look at some economic developments under the Yuan Dynasty. Well, something that is going to be a major increase, a major expansion from previous dynasties, even the Song Dynasty, is going to be the fact that the commercialization of the Chinese economy will greatly expand. The Song, they might have introduced the idea of commercialization, but the Mongols are going to take it up to 11, so to say. We will see kind of the expansion of merchant activity in China under the Mongols. And we see that for a few kind of reasons. For one thing, we are going to see the Mongols largely adopt and pioneer the practice of using paper money. Paper money, you can print out money a lot easier. The printing press is a thing at this point. It's developed in Korea. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But we are going to see kind of the use of the printing press. We're able to produce enough paper money for transactions. So we have a common currency to facilitate trade. But this currency is also standardized. We see that the Chinese, under the Mongols, they will utilize these very special stamps to prevent counterfeiting. And this is something that is true of many Eurasian societies, that they are trying to kind of standardize currency and make official counterfeit-proofed currency through the adoption of singular stamp systems. But we also see the Mongols encourage trade by building infrastructure. They build infrastructure in terms of kind of financial institutions like paper money, but also in improving Silk Road transportation, the roads in China that connect to these overland routes, but also improving the Great Canal. Generally, a dynasty is going to improve the Great Canal. So all of this is going to have the impact of increasing Silk Road trade, or at the very least, increasing China's participation in the Silk Road trade. And this is going to have a few kind of social impacts on Chinese history. So we are going to see the rise of the merchant class. They're going to be the prominent and dominant social class in Chinese society under the Mongols. But this is coming at the expense of the former ruling class, the scholar gentry. Remember the scholar gentry, they were those people that passed the civil service exam. They were the government workers who passed the jinshi, the government civil service exam. But now that the Mongols got rid of that civil service exam, there's really no importance of the scholar gentry anymore. And instead, it's the merchants. They're on top. But also, we are going to see the growth of corporations during these times. The Mongols, in order to promote trade, they are going to do all these things like paper money, like build up infrastructure, but they're also going to greatly impact the economy in general across Eurasia by facilitating the growth of merchant companies. These companies, they put a little bit of money in to profit off of what a merchant is able to buy and sell overseas, well, over land, so in other places across Eurasia. So corporations start to emerge, and a historian could argue that this is kind of the development of capitalism, a very early development of capitalism. You could argue, make the argument that the development of capitalism is kind of influenced indirectly, maybe, by Silk Road trade. So another kind of impact of this flourishing of the Silk Road is going to be increases in population. And this increase in population leads to urbanization. And here's a mantra to memorize in world history. Better agricultural technology means more food. More food means more people. More people means more cities. More cities mean more trade. So we are going to see that there will be, as a result of China's connection to the outside world, a diffusion of agricultural technology into China. And that's going to lead to agricultural increases in the long term. So in the long term, China's connection to outside influences, namely the Islamic world, is going to lead to an improvement of agricultural and manufacturing technology. So we do kind of see the incorporation of Islamic technology into Chinese society. For example, the water wheel. The water wheel helps out with irrigation. It helps out with manufacturing as well. The water wheel, it kind of turns. It's going to turn other things. I'm not a scientist. And that in turn will help facilitate improved manufacturing and agricultural production. So the water wheel has the impact of manufacturing. Also in terms of agriculture, it's bringing water from lower elevation to higher elevation. We see the invention and adoption of the loom. The loom essentially is a device that weaves fabric. So that starts to develop, majorly impacts the silk trade. And again, silk is important. Silk is very rare to get. And that is why it's such a valuable, I swear I'm not drunk, valuable kind of resource along the Silk Road. So the loom is improving kind of technology, is improving manufacturing output in the form of textiles like silk. We also see smelters as well. And smelters essentially are devices that help heat up iron, that help heat up metal. And that improves manufacturing, as you might be able to guess, but it also improves agriculture. Iron tools being used to farm fields. So the new technologies leading to developments in manufacturing and agricultural production. And in these cities, we kind of see that merchants have a higher status. Merchants are on top. And what do merchants do if they have money? They indulge in free time, in leisure culture. So we do see kind of the adoption of a lot of aspects of leisure culture by these merchants, these wealthy merchants in Chinese cities. For example, there's parks, there are gardens, there are opera houses, and to Marco Polo's astonishment, there are also public baths. Europe was stinky at the time. No one was bathing, really, except the Jews. That sounded worse than I did not intend it to sound worse. No, actually, there's a difference. Kind of Christian society in the Middle Ages, not a lot of bathing going on, but in kind of more ritual-based Jewish communities, especially in Eastern Europe, there is bathing, actually. And actually, the lack of bathing, that's going to be a major reason why the Black Death, will be so impactful in Europe, at least among Christians. It turns out keeping yourself clean, that prevents disease. Like, who knew? So wash your hands, folks. Anyway, there are some examples of how the Mongols were kind of introducing some elements of economic weakness. For example, let's take a look at a few. So when the Mongols initially invaded, they will destroy a lot of agriculture. And that will cause kind of short-term decreases in production because there will be a mini famine that breaks out. We do see that the Mongol invasions initially disrupt agricultural production, but long-term, remember, the Mongols are introducing new technologies into China. So we do kind of have this rough start for the Chinese economy. That also makes the Mongols not very popular. They literally caused a famine. We see that the Mongols are also going to discourage peasant production through very high taxes, but also something that will be a major problem under the Mongols in China, inflation. The Mongols, paper money, too much paper money, inflation. An increase in the cost of goods, a decrease in the value of the money. So you should be able to compare the Yuan Dynasty to earlier Chinese dynasties, especially the Song, and you should be able to identify some continuities and changes in Chinese history. Well, let's say goodbye to the Yuan Dynasty. So why is the Yuan Dynasty going to decline? Well, it declines for a few reasons. For one thing, there's massive amounts of decentralization that leads to internal conflicts between the Mongols. The Mongol princes, remember they rule over the different provinces. There's oftentimes disagreements between them. So we do see that internal divisions will weaken the empire. But also there's corruption. Remember, there could have not been corruption if they kept the civil service exam. Remember, government jobs were based on loyalty to the Mongol emperor. And as such, the Mongols, they might pick out guys that aren't necessarily good for the job. They might pick out the person who's the highest donor to the Chinese Mongol dynasty. But a major reason why the Mongols will decline is mostly because the fact that the Mongols are unpopular among the Chinese. Take a minute, think about why that is. What are some factors that make the Mongols unpopular among native Chinese people? Well, I'll tell you. You've got this ethnic hierarchy. You've got these high taxes. You've got the fact that Neo-Confucianism's being rejected, The fact that Neo-Confucianism stresses the idea of the Middle Kingdom, of Chinese cultural superiority. And yet China's being ruled over by a bunch of barbarians, by barbarians. So we do have this kind of unpopularity of the Mongols, which will lead to a lot of peasant discontentment. And you will also see nobles rebel against the Mongols. We see a series of rebellions by Song Dynasty loyalists. But what eventually kills the Mongols in China is the Red Turban Revolt. The Red Turban Revolt is a massive inter-Chinese-wide peasant revolt. It's led by the White Lotus Society, just as a kind of a description of who is organizing this. And the guy in kind of with the most political sway in this White Lotus Society is going to be a former unemployed guy by the name of Su Yuansang. And this is going to be a Chinese peasant. Su is a Chinese peasant who rises to the top militarily, and eventually, because of this Red Turban Revolt, will claim the mandate of heaven. And eventually, the Chinese are going to kick the Mongols out of China. The Mongols retreat back to Central Asia. And we do see that Su will found his own dynasty in Chinese history, the Ming Dynasty. Excuse me. And the Ming Dynasty is something we will explore in later episodes, later chapters. So you should be able to describe Mongol society under the Yuan Dynasty, and especially being able to compare it to other khanates that we've discussed in the past. So after this presentation, I'm not really going to talk about the Mongols anymore. And I love talking about the Mongols. They are fascinating people. But why are they important in the context of world history? It's not just because they're super duper cool, but it's because they're going to have a lot of impacts on world history, especially European and Asian history. But first, before we even look at that, generally the Mongols declined mostly because of their very decentralized nature. The Mongols, remember, extremely decentralized, even as a small Central Asian nomadic society. And really kind of, we see that reflected in their government structures when they set up institutions across Europe and Asia. They really leave local administration to locals. And these locals, what if they don't want to be a part of the Mongol Empire anymore? They just break away and form their own empire. So a major reason why the Mongols will decline is because first of this Khanate system dividing the empire into fourths, but then these Khanates, very decentralized, when they start to go away, new empires pop up. So the decentralized nature of the Mongol Empire is a major contributor to decline. But another contributor to decline is not only is there the lack of political centralization, but there's a lack of cultural unity. The Mongols, oftentimes, they will kind of become absorbed into local culture that's different from other places in the Mongol Empire. So, for example, in the Middle East, Mongols are mostly Muslim. In the Middle East, they're adopting these Islamic art styles right here. Whereas in some places like China, they're mostly things like Buddhist. They're painting stuff like this. So Mongols are going to be different culturally, depending on where they're from. And this is going to kind of be something that will contribute to a lack of political unity. There's no cultural unity. There's not even political unity. The empire bound to fall apart. But even though the Mongol Empire is very short-lived, there are some significances of the Mongol Empire in the broader context of world history. For one thing, just as a kind of little factoid, that the Mongol Empire is, by territory standards, going to be the largest land-based continuous empire in human history, stretching from Ukraine all the way to Korea, from Pakistan to Siberia, from Finland all the way to Vietnam. It's a huge land-based empire. Not a lot of people live in it, no one lives in Siberia, but it's a huge territorial expanse. And that territorial expanse led to the promotion of the Silk Road, for one thing, which in turn led to the spread of disease. Disease is going to be a major thing that spreads on the Silk Road, and that is going to increase because of increased trade that the Mongols are promoting. So the Black Death will be introduced across Eurasia, from Central Asia to Europe, thanks to the Mongols, indirectly. Arguably, you could say directly if you hold that the story of the Mongols had infected dead bodies thrown over city walls to spread disease. If you think that's a true story based on your historical interpretation, well, they might have intentionally spread it. But regardless, it does spread, mostly because of increased contacts between the East and the West. But this period of increased contacts between the East and the West is a time period in Eurasian history called the Pax Mongolica, and this is the biggest influence the Mongols have in world history. The Pax Mongolica is a 100-ish year period in which Eurasia will have political stability. There will be, at the very least, somewhat organized empires that cover the Silk Road, that are able to protect it, that are able to protect merchants from bandits. So there is political stability, which invariably leads to economic interactions. So the Silk Road is going to flourish under the Mongols, leading to increased communication between the East, China, and the West, Europe. And this is going to result in cultural and technological diffusion. We see religions spreading: Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Buddhism. But we're also going to see the exchange of technology, one of the biggest, of course, being gunpowder from China going across to Europe, for example. But another big influence of the Mongols is the fact that new empires and states will emerge largely either to reclaim the glory of the Mongols or out of a desire to resist the Mongols and drive them out of their respective societies. So we are going to see several Central Asian nomadic groups make their own empires. These Central Asian nomads, they were moved around by the Mongols, either militarily or to serve politically in a new administration. And we do see that kind of these groups of people, they'll say, hey, what if I had my own empire? And these include examples like the Timurid Empire, led by a Turco-Mongol noble by the name of Timur, or Tamerlane sometimes. Timurid Empire is going to be a short and brief one, but its influence will be felt in the future, because the Timurid Empire, breaking away from the Mongols on the inspiration and influence of guys like Timur, a former Mongol noble, we will see that an empire will form on the legacy of the on the Mongols. And the Timurid Empire is mostly important because when it breaks up, other empires will form in its wake. And two of those empires are the Mughals and we'll talk about Babur over here later on. But also the Safavids, this ginger beauty right here of Ismail the First, and we'll talk about him more later. And we've actually also introduced another empire that will emerge in the ashes of the Mongols, and that is the Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman Empire. We also have states that emerged largely to resist the Mongols. And those states include Russia. Remember, the Golden Horde was driven out because of the rise of Moscow, which invariably turned into Russia. We have the Ming Dynasty forming. And indirectly, we also have the Ashikaga shogunate. And we'll talk about that more later. But kind of really quickly, when the Mongols were in China, they tried to invade Japan twice. Then a typhoon came both times. Absolutely bad luck for them. So the Mongols are never going to invade Japan. But we do see that Japan is trying to be ready for them. And how do they do that? Well, they need new political organization, and that's what we'll talk about more later. So there's a great TED Ed video about the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire. I've watched that in my free time. But you should be able to identify some long-term significances of the Mongol Empire on Eurasian history. What are some long-term impacts of the Mongols on Eurasian history? Hint, think the Pax Mongolica. All right, well, I hope you had an excellent day. I'm sorry I got distracted sometimes in that. I hope you are doing well. I genuinely do. Have a great day, and I will see you when I see you. I'll see you when I see you. Yeah, all right, bye. I can sing. No, I can't.